So I was recently speaking at a coaching conference in Colorado. After I spoke, I sat in on some of the other speakers of the conference. And this has always been one of my favorite things to do is attend conferences and learn from other coaches. Now, one of the speakers at the conference, I think the speaker I took the most from that conference was today's guest of the podcast, Melissa Lamie. She's been the women's soccer coach at Grove City for 31 years. And I know that seems like a long time, and you might think a coach being around that long might start to be on the downward trajectory of their coaching career, but it's kind of just the opposite. The team has been turning out some of their best seasons ever, not just from a record standpoint, but most importantly, culturally, they're as strong as ever. What was most impressive about Melissa to me, though, was not her stories of success, but the practical tools she was sharing with coaches and how she built culture. And so I knew after listening to her for 40 minutes, this was a coach who was super intentional about our leadership and culture, and she'd be great for all our listeners of the podcast. Now, today, she is going to tell us a little bit about her story in coaching and what has made some of her more recent teams special. We're also going to do a deep dive into how she created core values for her team, and more importantly, how she empowers her team to operationalize those values, to decide how they want them to be lived out each season. In our follow-up episode with Melissa, we are going to do a deep dive into their leadership council, or as she calls it, her leadership group. It's a highly informative and practical episode because we're also going to talk about how they practice gratitude to really train that mindset of gratitude within the team, and how she makes up for her weakness as a communicator by doing consistent one-on-ones throughout the year with their players and what they call their 4S meetings. So lock in and get ready for the next two episodes of the podcast because they are going to be jam-packed with tools for coaches. So I also want to remind you to not forget about getting the notes to every episode of the podcast. All you need to do is subscribe to our weekly newsletter at tocculture.com or in the details of this episode, so you don't have to try taking notes while you're driving the car or like me when I'm out for a run or walking the dog. Be sure to subscribe to the newsletter so you get those notes as well as our weekly article. Welcome to the Coaching Culture Podcast, the podcast to help you grow as a leader and build a better culture. My name is JP Nurbin, and I'm joined by my friends and co-hosts, Nate Sanderson and Betsy Butterick. Actually, Nate sat today's interview out. In addition to this podcast, I'm the founder of TOC, which supports leaders and their teams to build extraordinary cultures through one-on-one coaching, consulting, online training, and speaking. To learn more about my work to support coaches, I recommend starting with these three steps. First off, read my book, The Culture System. You can get it at Amazon or Audible or Apple Books. Secondly, as I mentioned earlier, subscribe to the TOC newsletter. You'll get every Thursday something in your inbox that's going to help you be a better coach. And lastly, and probably one of the most impactful things you can do as a coach, as well as other coaches in your program or club can do, which is get trained through our transformational coaching and culture certification program. You can do all those things and learn more about TOC at tocculture.com. To learn more about Betsy Butterick and her work as a leadership coach, go to betsybutterick.com. So, Melissa, I'm super excited for this conversation. I had the fortune of hearing you speak in Denver at the Colorado Coaches Association, and you were my favorite speaker because I just loved how you got to the practical things around how to build culture, not just the things, it's kind of at a 30,000 foot view, but you really got into the practical things that I think our coaches really appreciate in this podcast. So welcome to the Coaching Culture Podcast.
Thank you. I love it. I've been a listener for a long time, so I'm excited to be on the other side.
Let's start off with just what actually kind of captivated me in my conversation with you in Denver, which is you just came off of one of your more impressive seasons on a winning standpoint, but as also as a cultural standpoint, where you're coaching and women's soccer, especially after 31 years of coaching. I think that's an important point to note too, like to have 31 years of coaching and still be having some of your best seasons ever is pretty impressive. So could you just start by just kind of giving us a little bit of an overview of the story of this incredible season you guys just had?
Yeah, I was just trying to tell a recruit about it last week, and my assistant and I both afterwards noticed that we didn't really talk about, we won the conference championship. We were the number one seed. We went to the NCAA tournament, which doesn't happen every year. So we weren't talking about any of those things. We were talking about the team environment. We were talking about our senior leaders and how much they had invested. We were talking about how if they went and sat with any group of kids from that team, while they were there on campus, they would feel something different because that team was so special. And it is like secondary to us that we won games and that we won the conference championship. And that was great too. That was I will always think of it as a 4-year journey for our seniors that they won it that year because they were the COVID babies when they were freshmen. They came in that year that everything was different and had to navigate that. And they did a really great job of that, I thought, and turned out to be just some very resilient leaders that brought a whole new aspect. Like this is now the high watermark for me for team culture.
Yeah. So if you look back at the season, I mean, is there any one or two moments that really stand out to you as just the moments that you will remember of like, man, that was what a great team is about, or that's what I'll remember most about that team?
There was definitely a turning point for us. I felt it was when we played the reigning conference champs. We had to play over at their field. Before we got on the bus, we had a meeting and talked about some of our mentality going into that because we had struggled a lot with overcoming going down one goal. And how do we get past that? Because that always had, for the last couple of years, had kind of defeated us. We hadn't been able to push through that. The game before that, we had gone up 3-0 in the first half and conceded 3 goals in the second half to end up with a tie in that game. So we were still struggling with that. And I remember just having our team meeting before that game. And I had just gotten an email from a former player who had told me how grateful she was for making her run these certain runs that we used to do because she could draw on that in her recent battle with breast cancer that she had just gone through. And so I read that to the team and I said, you guys need those stories of hard things too, where you have overcome them so that later in your life, you will be able to draw from that as well. And that game, we never shut anybody out. We always tried to score more goals. And that game, we ended up winning 1-0, shutting them out on their home field. They're a really good team. They had a great goal scorer starting for them. And I felt like that was a huge turning point for us just because mentally it changed everything for us. And I can remember another moment, which this is the worst moment, but it was the way that this person went through it. It was a great moment. It was our last regular season game, about 15 minutes into the game, and one of our starting seniors who was a key player for us went down with a torn ACL. And I think the way it happened, I think everybody kind of knew it, but the way she acted, it made it very like, don't worry about it. I'll be fine. It's not a big deal. Turns out she did tear her ACL, but the way that she then became one of our leaders from the bench and it just like, she didn't miss a beat. It was like, whatever the team needs, I'm just going to try and do it. And I think that allowed us to go on and have a run through the tournament. We won, the semifinals and the final of the tournament to get to the NCAA. So the way she handled that, I think is going to be a story that I tell in the future.
And Melissa, we often, when we talk about great teams, great culture, great chemistry, we talk about overcoming adversity and sort of two schools of thoughts when it comes to building resilience with a team. It's like we did all these hard things, and so we've become really resilient. And then there's the other piece of resilience is built through having the support that you need to tackle tough things, regardless of outcome, knowing that you're going to be okay. Talk to us a little bit about what support looks like within this previous year's team.
One of our core values in our team culture is we support the team mission regardless of individual circumstances. So I think when a team embraces that really well, it was like that one player who who it didn't matter what role she had to play now. It didn't matter what, circumstances were for her. She was still going to be there for the team. And we have stories like that all over our program. One of our other core values is to love, care, and support each other at all times and all places. And that was something I think this team did really well off the field for each other. They were there for each other. They checked in with each other. They made it a point to be present for each other. Our freshmen could tell you, like, they felt support from day one. They felt welcome. They felt that they could do their best work from day one because they knew that the team would be there for them.
I really love your core values. I know you have shared those with me. Some of them you've already just shared there. Other ones that I loved were just, we love the game and we let it show. We leave everything on the field. You've got 8 of those. How did you come up with those core values as a coach?
Good question, because I didn't, honestly. When I first started coaching, I didn't know anything about culture, team culture, being intentional about it, core values, none of it. I always say if I could go back, that would be the one thing that I would tell my first year self. But once I got into it, I think it was probably 10 years into my coaching, and I had just started the leadership group with my team. So rather than having team captains, we switched to a leadership group, and I started to do some work with them in the off season. And probably 2 to 3 years after that, our leadership group created what they called a team contract, and they wrote out most of those core values. I've changed them a little bit and added a little bit. But they wrote those out almost word for word and hung it in the locker room. They made everyone sign it, and they hung it in the locker room. And I honestly didn't have a lot to do with it. I knew it was there, and I saw it a lot. And I looked at it and said, oh, yeah, those are good things. Let's do those things, But then I started to recognize, like, hey, we can be kind of intentional about that up front. Like, let's do this every year, And so kind of from there, it started like, do we want it to be that every year? Or, should we change it? Should we let another group do it? Should we let the next leadership group do it? So it ended up, I think it probably ended up that I just took it on myself to decide that that's what I wanted it to be. So I think I changed a couple things. I added that supporting the team mission, regardless of individual circumstances, like word for word quote from Anson Dorrance's list of core values. We've probably flipped things around a little bit, just wording of some things, but the way it is now is probably the way it's been for probably almost 15 years now, 10 to 15 years now. So the big thing is that I always tell kids is like, this is the words, but you get to choose every year how it gets lived out and how you're going to make it happen, basically. So we do spend time each year as a team talking about operationalizing our core values.
I think that's a key point that you mentioned there, Melissa, because one of my questions for JP, when I read your core values, I was like, oh, these are great. Like you said, like these are good things that we should probably do as a successful program of people who care about people. And my question for JP was, I really want to know how Melissa onboards new members of the program into these core values that were not created by them. But when you say we're really intentional about having that conversation within the team every year of how do we operationalize these values, that sounds to me like it's creating more of the buy-in. Do you ever get, radical resistance where people are like, no, like those are terrible. I don't want to do that. And if so, how have you navigated that within the team?
Yeah, I wouldn't say anyone has been vehemently opposed. I would say more so there's, a certain kid that comes into the program who really espouses one or two of them more than another. And we try to, we have 36 kids in the program. So like, they're not all going to be great at all 8 things, so it's more like, where can you plug in and make an impact? Which one of these is like fits who you are? So like, and we always talk about like the freshmen, as far as onboarding, they know what they are. They always know what they are. We talk about them at ID camp. We talk about them, before they come, they have to memorize them, all the things. So they know what they are, but then the first few weeks, maybe month of the season is all about them seeing it in action from the upperclassmen, from our leaders. And that is usually, it doesn't take them long to like love it and buy in and want to be part of it. So then we work towards them becoming, instead of what we call receivers of the culture, but to be drivers of the culture by the time they lead.
There's so much I want to pack there. I definitely want to come back to leadership group, and we will be coming back to that because you mentioned that earlier. But I love how you're just getting them to play their strengths. I had questions around onboarding. You just answered those, right? Just because you got to onboard them to the values early on, in the recruitment process, prepare that soil, getting players to demonstrate those. I'm curious when you talk about operationalizing these core values. I'm curious, what that conversation looks like with the team. Set the stage. When does it happen in the year? What type of meeting is that? Is it multiple meetings? How do you operationalize those each season?
There's probably not one way that I've done it. There's probably multiple ways. I think sometimes I've done it in our spring season with our, now our returning players for next year without the freshmen. We've done it where we literally, I put this up on the board in Colorado, but Brene Brown, operationalizing your values. We did it pretty close to how exactly she would do it, where we had poster boards with all our values on each one, and everybody just went around and wrote things on the posters, and then we tried to narrow it down to a few things for each one. And in the fall, when we come back, we have preseason camp, which is awesome. It's my favorite week of the year because we're here for soccer and they don't have any school. And school's important, but that's why that week is fun, because they don't ever have to think about or worry about schoolwork. So we do soccer 24/7. And we have tons and tons of meetings. We have culture class, we call it, and where we just can do some of those exercises like that, where we're very specific about it. This past season, I actually had our leadership group teach. Each one of them took one. There happened to be 8 people in our leadership group this year. So each one took one core value and they were in charge of teaching it. So we had 1 or 2 every day, and they basically just kind of talked about what it meant for them, where they've seen it happening in their couple, 2-3 years, and allowing them to teach. Later in the season, we had a day after practice where we just brought the freshmen up and said, each of the freshmen, tell us, where you've seen this core value in action. Where have you seen somebody live this out? Just give us one example. Give us one example. So then they start to recognize where it's happening and how to do it themselves. We sat down as a team halfway through the season, and we have small groups on our team. So I had a small group activity where they had a evaluation sheet to fill out, like, how is our team doing on core value number 3? Where is it happening? Where do we need to improve? Where do we need to do better? Who's a great example of this? Things like that. Sometimes it's part of our postseason evaluation. Evaluate yourself. How did you do living out the core values this year? And who is your standard for this core value that you see on our team? Which I always try to give the people who are chosen as a standard, try to let them know, hey, 15 people look at you as the standard for this core value. And then they kind of take some ownership of that.
I love how you personalize the standard. And I say that because in a lot of programs, I often hear a reference to a standard. That's not our standard, or that's below our standard, or we have to meet the standard. But the standard is like this other thing. And through the way that you're intentional about asking questions, not only are you seeing actions of how do we live this standard, what does it look like, but even 15 people see you as the embodiment of this standard. Now it's personal, and that relational nature, I think that's a different way of looking at or working with standards. And I really appreciate that.
What I'm really hearing is you do a really good job of establishing not just core values, but standards, behavioral type standards, and setting that early on. And then I love the review process, that your self-review, peer reviews, not just to call people out, but to actually celebrate people, and to celebrate people, like Betsy was saying, and just how they demonstrate they are those standard bearers. I think that's great. The other thing I'm asking here, though, is everything comes back to my culture system and establish support and enforce. Like, okay, what does accountability look like in your program when we don't have the behaviors that we expect of each other, when we're doing things that we're not supposed to tolerate? How is it? Is it yourself? Is it the leadership group? Like, what does accountability look like for you guys?
Very much the leadership group will probably handle that first. So Mondays before practice, we have our leadership group meetings. And one of the things I ask them every week, and again, this year it worked out, there's 8 people. They each had a core value that they taught and evaluated. And then I made them the police. I didn't call it the police. I made them the person who was kind of in charge of seeing if it's happening on the team. So every Monday we had check-in time. Where do you see it happening? Do we need to fix it? Is there any place it's sliding? Is there anybody we need to talk to about it? And I think I mentioned this in Colorado. One of the greatest things about this season for me is I never had those conversations with any kids. So kids, I mean, not all kids meet every standard, like I said, but they're trying. They're working towards it. They're trying to figure out, where do I get to have an impact in this area in our team culture? Doesn't matter how much I play, doesn't matter, what class I'm in, it doesn't matter. So that I would say it happens more at the leadership group level. And I'm not saying that I've never had to address it as a coach, because we've had some player meetings before where we've had to talk about it. But we also are pretty consistent about communicating with them on an individual level. So when we see it, we can tell them and they can ask questions about it as well.
One thing I'm hearing, and we started with JP referencing the fact that you've been at the same institution for 31 years, which is a rarity, I'll say, in the athletics landscape today. First of all, congratulations. That's awesome. Second of all, what I'm hearing in a lot of your responses is when you say things like, well, I don't know that I've done it the same every year, or, well, this year it looked like this. And just hearing that intentional flexibility, that openness and receptivity to change. Talk about, if you will, from a coaching perspective, besides that openness, that flexibility based on who's currently on your roster, what have you found yourself also being open to, or also changing in terms of just yourself as a coach?
Well, I didn't grow up in the game of soccer. I actually grew up in the game of basketball. So I still feel like I don't know very much about soccer. Like, I've been coaching for 31 years, but I didn't really start like studying it and watching it more. I mean, it wasn't on TV when we grew up. So I watched Big East basketball when I grew up. That was about it. So I feel like I'm still learning a lot about the game. And I don't, it's funny because I'm not, in some ways, I don't think I'm very flexible, but in other ways, I do not mind trying new things, I guess. I would say one of the things that I have had to adapt most recently to is, I think I always assumed that kids want to play soccer because they want to win. Because I think I just always assumed that that was going to be part of the deal. Like, when I get kids on a team, we're going to try to win. So my whole culture thing, like, it doesn't talk about winning. It doesn't talk about anything really other than working hard and taking care of the person next to you. So it's like, I've had to be a little more intentional of like talking about that. Like, hey, we want to win. We don't have to win. We want to win, but you have to prepare to win. You have to approach it with that end in mind. We want to beat every team that we step on the field with. So that was like understood. I never had to say that before. So now I do find myself saying that a little more. Well, and again, the big struggle then is, how do you do that and love each other really well? And like this balancing act kind of, do you have to be a jerk to be a really great competitor? I don't think so, but it's hard to balance that.
How have you stayed hungry on this journey. Like you've been coaching 31 years, and I talk to coaches that have been in it 10 to 15 years, and it can be very discouraging. You go through a season with a lot of losses, or you have a lot of wins, and you still have players that jump in the transfer portal or are disgruntled, not happy with their playing time, right? Like coaching is a tough profession. And yet, when I hear you talk now, and I saw you speak there last month, it was like, she looks like she's got another 30 years left in her.
Yeah,
And I don't know if that's true or not, but you seem to be really, passionate, and you're obviously still up learning and trying to continuously evolve to best or better practices.
yeah, I don't know. There's something that I love sports. I mean, I'm watching basketball. I coach my daughter's junior high basketball team. I go to some of the lacrosse games. I go like lacrosse. I don't understand it at all, but trying to learn. And I think some of it is when I first started, we were coaching two sports. We were teaching, we were doing intramurals, all these things. And now it's like, whew, all I have to do is coach soccer. And it's like, now I can get into dig into it a little more. So it's been really fun to do that, just to have the time to do that. I think another thing is Grove City College itself. The kids that come here are really great kids. I mean, I never dreamed that this would be my only job, but there's no way I would leave at this point. And even after like 2-3 years, I was like, how could I not go back? But I also married my husband 3 years into it, who's the men's basketball coach here. So we're very entrenched at this point. So our kids have grown up here, and I don't know, we're pretty, it's just still great to me to be part of sports, number one, to have great kids to coach, and probably has saved me from a lot of those headaches. And great administration that supports us and everything. Like we're just in a sweet spot right now. Like I can tell you where we've been. It's been different, and coming out of that. And I used to be faculty, everybody got hired as faculty. Now everybody gets hired as a coach. And like I said, my job description is different now. It's coaching. And I always said, if I had to choose between all of those pieces of my job that I used to do, I would take the coaching. The rest of it was, you just have to get through it. But the coaching was like, that was the reward on the other end. So.
Okay, so what I just heard from Melissa that I don't always hear or see in coaches is gratitude. Gratitude to coach sports, to work and be able to impact kids today. Far too often as coaches, we can slip into a sense of entitlement. That kids owe us, parents owe us, things shouldn't be this hard. I don't know if I want to put up with kids anymore. Like those types of things that really are just not grateful, like Melissa is, about the privilege to be able to coach. Some other great takeaways from today's episode, though, I think that it's really impactful how these great teams, how they kind of formed. It was through their response to adversity, COVID, torn ACLs, things like that. Those were the turning points. So it's a great reminder for us as coaches when we're going through that these are the moments that make or break a great team. Creating core values is one thing that I think a lot of coaches discuss, are unsure about, and it's just great to hear another way it can be done. In this case, it was co-created with the leadership group. That Melissa comes in, she puts her own stamp on it, takes some also from things from other people like Anson Dorrance. One of the core values comes from him, and then she's carrying that forward. I think that's really important for coaches to hear that story, because we often want what's the best way to do it. Well, there's a lot of ways to do it, and oftentimes it's going to look a little bit more messy than we think it should. Really, most important thing here is operationalizing your values, right? Figuring out how you want to live them out, giving your players the space to co-create what that looks like. And here, these team meetings in the preseason are where they operationalize those values. This meeting doesn't look the same each year, right? But the important thing is that she's consistent. She's evolving and changing what that meeting looks like, but probably makes it a little bit more interesting and engaging for the athletes. But it's also about her improving. Just she's constantly finding better ways to do things. She's being intentional. Coaches, if you want more practical strategies, tools, and tips to intentionally build your team culture, follow at TOC Culture on Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. As I've shared before, we've recently started our Culture Builders podcast series as a video cast. It's nearly every day we're sharing 1 to 2 minute videos for coaches, athletes, and sports parents. So follow us on Instagram, YouTube, or TikTok at TOC Culture. Thanks for listening in. Please be sure to share this episode if you found it valuable, as well as leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts.